Let's do that. Let me share my screen, which hopefully will work. Basic, we're going to go to that. Sorry, me muttering. It's always whether I can manage to do it properly. Perfect. Right, I probably didn't introduce myself as you were all coming in. My name is Liz Leplat, and I'm an ambassador for the Public Health Collaboration, which is a national charity set up by a group of concerned healthcare professionals with the aim of tackling the rising tide of obesity, type 2 diabetes, and other so-called lifestyle diseases. We do actively lobby government at every opportunity to try and change the dietary guidelines, and also we work at grassroots level, helping patients take control of their own health by making lifestyle changes. It's in my capacity as an ambassador for the PHC that I've been running low carb courses for several GP surgeries in Basingstoke. But before I get on to the details of the courses, I would like to give you a little bit of an idea of my own background and how I came to volunteer for the PHC. This was me 3 years ago, June 2017. I weighed 14 stone 2, and shortly after the photo was taken, I was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes with a fasting glucose of 8.6 and HbA1c of 68. As I was already eating what I thought was a relatively healthy diet, I mean, I had, you know, the usual wholemeal bread, pasta, jacket potatoes, my 5 a day. I was fanatical about my 5 a day, fat-free yogurts and semi-skimmed milk, no ready meals or takeaways. I've always cooked for myself. Okay, so I had the odd pork pie and a couple of ice creams a week, but generally I ate in line with the national guidelines. So my GP prescribed metformin. However, I'd heard it was possible to put type 2 diabetes in remission without medication. So I went home, did a bit of research online. I know everybody's heart sinks, and ultimately decided to follow Dr. Michael Mosley's 8-week blood sugar diet rather than take the tablets. And this, whilst calorie counted, is also a low carb approach. And having read his book, this made perfect sense to me. I started in mid-September 2017, and by mid-December, my HbA1c had dropped to 35 from 68. My triglycerides, and I have a history of severe hypertriglyceridemia, they were 27 on diagnosis. Having been around 6 or 7 for many years on fenofibrate, dropped to 1.7. I stopped all my cholesterol and lipid meds, halved my blood pressure medication, and by early 2018, I'd lost 4 stone, gone down 4 dress sizes, and felt better than I had in years. I joined a couple of online support groups over that period, which ultimately led me to the PHC. Through the PHC, I then became aware of the work of David Unwin, who's an award-winning GP with a practice in Southport in the north of England. Nearing retirement, he was feeling a bit dissatisfied with life and asking himself what he'd achieved over the course of his career, you know, those sort of inward thoughts. And in particular, he felt he'd failed his diabetic patients and frankly dreaded seeing them because he felt he could never offer them anything other than a bit of sympathy and more medication as the disease progressed. In fact, he so dreaded seeing them that he'd more or less been leaving them entirely in the care of the younger partners in the practice. He was the senior partner. Until one day, whilst helping to clear a backlog in the waiting room, he called out a name before realising it was one of the diabetic patients. His heart sank, but as he looked up, he saw a woman walk towards him that he didn't recognise. However, she recognised him and straight away said, "Oh, Dr. Unwin, you're going to be very cross with me." He naturally asked her why. Here she was, she'd lost so much weight he'd not even recognised her. She looked fantastic. But she told him, "Well, you know, you gave me those leaflets about my diabetes. Well, I went online." And as I know, you know, professionals, your heart sinks when patients say that. But anyway, she told him she'd found diabetes.co.uk and joined their low carb programme. And sure enough, when David checked her results, she was in remission from diabetes. He'd never seen a patient. He'd been in practice for, I think it was 35 years at the time. He'd never seen a diabetic go into remission, despite the best efforts of both doctor and patient. Reasonable control, yes, but remission, no. And to his credit, rather than berate her for going against his advice, he went away and started to do some research of his own. He looked up diabetes.co.uk and discovered that at that time they had over 250,000 people in several countries following their low carb programme and putting their type 2 in remission. It's now nearing 500,000 actually on the programme. How come, he asked himself, I don't know about this? I'm a doctor. Surely I should know about this. So he started to do more research. he read about the work of Professor Taylor in Newcastle and the study they did up there, where they were achieving almost 50% remission in their trials. And he looked at the work being done by Virta Health in the USA, who obtained similar results. And the more he read, the more it made sense. He went back in his mind and tried to remember the basic chemistry and biology he'd done at uni and the way in which the body processes nutrients, etc. And he realized that if the problem with diabetes is the body's inability to deal with excess glucose, then it makes sense that if you reduce the glycemic load, you reduce the problem. So instead of masking the symptoms with medication and pushing the problem under the carpet, so to speak, you go straight to the nub of the issue, and that is, of course, excess glucose. He thought back to his student days. I'm sure you remember these diagrams too. The first one up there on the left is a monosaccharide or simple glucose. The second is a disaccharide, sucrose or table sugar. And then we have the polysaccharides, which are complex carbs, which are nothing more than long chains of simple monosaccharides or glucose molecules linked by oxygen bonds, which soon break down once they reach the stomach. So it should come as no surprise, if we think about it for a moment, that all carbohydrates ultimately digest down to glucose. We all know we should give up sugar, but of course it's not just the sugar. To demonstrate this, here we have a simple diagram of an iceberg. I know it's a bit of a rough diagram, but anyway, which I used during the course to show how the peak of the iceberg represents the simple sugars, the obvious ones like sugar in tea and coffee, or sprinkled on cereals, and obviously in cakes and biscuits, etc. But below the surface is a mountain of hidden sugars, the natural sugars such as honey or agave syrup, for example. Our bodies can't distinguish between these and the white stuff. So whilst it's true they're less processed, the effect on blood glucose is exactly the same. Also fruits with a high sugar content like mangoes, pineapples and bananas, but also starchy veg like potatoes and parsnips. Why do onions caramelize? Because of the sugar content. Though we're not suggesting, of course, removing onions completely from your diet, just reducing the amount you use. Then possibly less immediately recognizable as sources of glucose, the processed carbs like bread and pasta. All of these will raise blood glucose levels, and often surprisingly quickly, even in non-diabetics. This is another GP, Simon Tobin, who's a colleague of David Unwin, a bit younger than David, who, as you can see, is slim, fit. He's an ambassador for the Parkrun scheme. He's not diabetic and has no known health problems at all. Last summer, he decided to test a Freestyle Libre. And I don't know if any of you have done this, but I can recommend it as it's quite an eye-opener, as Simon was to discover. Colleagues and friends, he put it on Twitter that this was what he was going to do and said, you don't even make any suggestions. So colleagues and friends quickly asked him to test out loads of different foods over the course of the 2 weeks. And he did so, as he put it, so that the rest of us didn't need to. So he started day one with a bowl of Alpen, so-called healthy option, which caused a peak of 9 millimoles, which, as you can see, took time to resolve. And remember, Simon's not diabetic. Yet we all know that raised glucose levels are harmful, causing damage to the blood vessels, damage that in time can lead to heart disease and stroke, for example. Later in the same day, you can see here still this is the spike from the morning's muesli, but at lunchtime he has a low carb lunch of a 3-egg omelette with ham and cheese, and the maximum glucose reading is 6.1, well within the normal limits of, we reckon, sort of between 4 and 7, so he's fine. Following day, someone asked him to eat a classic McDonald's, so he sort of swallowed his pride and ate a McDonald's. And he had a spike of 12.3 millimoles. He's not diabetic, yet this is the sort of damage repeated over time that leads to a myriad of health problems. Fed up with the carb overload, again, Simon went for his typical low-carb evening meal. In this case, he had stir-fried peppers, kale, herb-fed chicken, a nice dollop of guacamole, and a heap of grated cheddar. He washed it all down with 2 glasses of red wine and finished up with coffee and cream. No spike at all, maximum of 6.2. And yet he's had a delicious and nutrient-dense real food meal. No wonder most people who try low carb enjoy it. They've got no feelings of guilt or denial. And this is really important when it comes to maintaining a lifestyle change. Anyone can go on a diet, any diet, and lose weight. That's the easy bit. The hard bit is keeping the weight off. And on a standard low-fat diet, that's very hard to do. Either you don't eat fatty things, you cut the lovely caramelized fat off your steak, or you put skimmed milk in your coffee and you eat fat-free yogurts and 0-calorie salad dressings, none of which taste very nice. So it's tempting to slip back into your old ways, or you eat them and then feel guilty about it. Either way, it's a recipe for failure and the weight piles back on. I know because I was a yo-yo dieter for my entire life. I mean, I was sent to a diet clinic when I was in my late teens, until I changed to low carb 3 years ago. Simon did a lot more testing, but for now I'm just going to end with the one breakfast that's so often recommended for diabetics, and that is porridge. Simon had it with nothing added so it wouldn't confuse the results. And the result was that his glucose went up to over 8 millimoles and stayed there for nearly 2 hours. And this isn't good for anybody because, as the technician who performed my first diabetic eye test told me, it's the spikes that cause the damage. And that's something I've never forgotten, and it informs the way I eat now. Despite the fact that I'd only recently been diagnosed, by recently I mean literally 2 or 3 weeks before I had this first eye test, I already had mild retinopathy, which is an obvious sign that I'd been metabolically unhealthy long before official diagnosis. My next test, however, the following year showed complete reversal of the damage, and it's remained clear for the last 3 years. I can also tell you that Dr. Ian Lake, who is also a GP and another founder, member of the PHC, he's also a type 1 diabetic, and obviously had followed NHS guidelines for most of his life as a type 1 diabetic. He had more serious retinopathy, but then he changed to a low carb lifestyle 4 years ago. And now after those 4 years, even that more severe eye damage has completely reversed and he has no sign of retinopathy now. So again, the message is clearly one of hope, in that many instances damage can be reversed and will at the very least be halted. But back to David for a moment. He and his wife Jen decided that if they were going to test this low carb theory on their patients, they should at least give it a go themselves. In no time, David's pre-diabetes went into remission. They both lost weight. And above all, David couldn't believe how much more energy he had. He'd taken to locking his consulting room door every afternoon and having a lie down on his examination couch. But now he had boundless energy and was full of enthusiasm about this new chapter in his career. And so they started a low carb group at their practice, inviting both diabetic and pre-diabetic patients to come along. David shares their successes on Twitter, with their permission, of course, and in medical journals, of course. This shows the progression of just one of their early successes. And this patient is now fully 6 years in remission. One of the criticisms of low carb, usually by those who've never done it, is that it's not sustainable. Yet there are thousands of people around the globe following a low carb lifestyle who wouldn't dream of going back to the way they were. I'd battled with weight my entire life. As I said, I was referred to a hospital diet clinic in my late teens, and I'd subsequently done a couple of rounds of Weight Watchers. And yes, the weight came off, but it always went back on again. Yet now, for the first time in my life, I've maintained my weight loss for over 3 years, thrown out all the large size clothes that I always kept in the back of the wardrobe before, because I sort of felt I'd probably need them, even though each time I dieted, I sort of thought this is the time, and it never was. And I can now look forward to the rest of my low carb life, free from worrying about the complications of type 2 diabetes. Why wouldn't you want to be able to maintain that? One of the biggest benefits reported by all GPs who run low carb groups or support their patients in making these changes is improved job satisfaction. Instead of telling patients that type 2 diabetes is progressive and the only answer is more drugs, to give them hope and see the change in them as their health returns is a very satisfying thing to do as a doctor. And it's a win-win situation. You get happy patients, a reduced workload, and a saving in your drugs bill too. David's practice saves between, varies from year to year, about 45 to 50,000 pounds a year on diabetes drugs alone. And at the latest count, they have 85 patients in full drug-free remission from type 2 diabetes, some of those having been insulin dependent for many years. Multiply that up across the country, and we have a saving of millions of pounds for the NHS. But what's more, David found that the other health markers improved too. HDL cholesterol usually goes up, despite eating foods that include saturated fats. Triglycerides come down. As I said, my own hypertriglyceridemia has virtually resolved. And after 30 years of medication, I now take no lipid meds at all. Blood pressure too tends to reduce. Only recently, David published data on the deprescribing of hypertensive drugs. On a low-carb diet, patients don't retain water to the same extent. This means they also need to drink more water and eat more salt than is usually in a standard low-fat diet. And yet their blood pressure also, on average, goes down, as you can see from this chart. So in addition to the savings on diabetes medication, there are savings in other medications as well, not to mention the health outcomes of the patients. We've had 2 patients who joined our course in the last 6 months who've had to stop all blood pressure medication already because their blood pressure has come down significantly. In 2016, David was awarded Innovator of the Year for his pioneering work. And in 2018, in conjunction with the RCGP, he launched a training module for all GPs. It's a half-hour module, free to access. I've created a data sheet to accompany this presentation that I can email to anyone who's interested. And the link to this training course is included on that data sheet. Earlier this year too, David, together with Campbell Murdoch, who's another GP, founder member of the PHC and who runs a low carb group at his practice in Bath, and David Cavan, who is a diabetes consultant working in the NHS and author of very useful books too on low carb self-management of both type 1 and type 2 diabetes, collaborated to produce a guide for GPs and other healthcare professionals on adapting medication for low carb management of type 2. This link too is on the data sheet I've prepared. For patients on insulin or gliclazide, for example, it's important to reduce the dose from the outset to avoid the risk of hypos or other complications. Because with the reduced carb load, the need for insulin is much reduced virtually from day one. To help patients understand the effect on their blood glucose of the foods they were eating, David also created a series of glucose equivalence infographics based on the glycemic index, comparing the effect of blood glucose on blood glucose of common foods, comparing them with teaspoonfuls of sugar, which is something that can easily be understood by everyone. So, for example, an average portion of 150 grams of rice in terms of the effect on blood glucose is the equivalent of eating 10 teaspoonfuls of sugar. This generally comes as quite a shock to most people, medical professionals included. These are invaluable as a tool in educating patients about the true impact of what they're eating on their blood glucose levels. And again, of course, if you use a constant glucose monitor, again, you see these effects starkly in front of you. Once seen, they can't be unseen. There are 7 of the charts in total, and again, a link to them is on the data sheet. They can be printed off, laminated and pinned up in consulting rooms and waiting areas. This, for example, is what many patients have for breakfast. I know because it's the first question I asked them at the start of the low carb course. Traditionally, it might well be considered a healthy breakfast: cereal, semi-skimmed milk, wholemeal toast, and a glass of apple juice or orange juice, whatever. Yet this is the equivalent of eating 21 teaspoonfuls of sugar. This is going to result in a huge insulin spike, leading to fat storage in the liver, often resulting in non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, something else that's increased exponentially over the last few decades. David illustrated this with a slide of a lady who had abnormal liver function for years. He'd sent her to several consultants who'd all of them told her that she should stop drinking or drink less. She insisted all she ever had was a sherry at Christmas. And in fact, she got so fed up with the consultants obviously not believing her that she refused to go to see any others of them. But yet when she was then diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, gave up the starchy carbs, and within a short space of time, her fatty liver had completely resolved. Type 2 diabetes, as I'm sure you're aware, is also the leading cause of kidney dialysis, neuropathy. The NHS performs over 200 amputations a week due to diabetes. 1 in 6 inpatients in hospital is a diabetic, and diabetes is strongly associated with dementia. You're twice as likely to develop, at least twice, if not 3 times more likely to develop dementia if you have type 2 diabetes, because the function of the blood-brain barrier becomes impaired by the glucose and the way the glucose and the insulin stop functioning properly. All of this puts a huge strain on the NHS and, of course, on the people like you who are at the centre heart of it, not to mention the distress to patients and their relatives. But it wasn't always like this. If you look at photographs from the 40s and 50s, even the 70s, there's hardly an overweight person in sight. And yet you can see there were less gyms around, people exercised less on the whole. Yes, there was more physical work, perhaps people walked to work a bit more, but they didn't exercise like they do now. They on the whole ate more calories, and yet they stayed lean. So maybe it isn't all about the calories. And if you look around any high street now, half the people are overweight or obese, and I'm sure you see that in your surgeries too. So why is this? I'm sure you're familiar with the Public Health England Eat Well guide, which recommends that 1/3 of your diet should be made up of starchy carbs. But I hope you're beginning to see that feeding carbs to a diabetic is a bit like giving Snickers bars to someone with a nut allergy or croissants to a celiac. Their bodies can't cope with them. But perhaps if you know who wrote the guidelines, things might become clearer. Public Health England put together a committee to write the guidelines, and these were the members. The 3 at the bottom have no conflicts of interest, but 2 of those only ever attended the first meeting. The rest were representatives of the food industry. You can see them, the Abbott Nutrition, Belvita, Danone, Kellogg's, Mars, McDonald's, you name it, they're in there. And as Dr. Zoe Harcombe, who's a leading nutritionist, says, it's a bit like putting Dracula in charge of the blood bank. Is Mr. Kellogg going to be very happy if his representative suggests abolishing cereals? Obviously not. So we arrive at the marketing of healthy cereals, whole grains, everything in moderation, and the mantra that we must all eat less and move more. I'm going to add at this point that whilst I fully accept the benefits of exercise, and indeed encourage course participants to exercise, we have a whole session on different forms of exercise and what the benefits are. I lost 4 stone and put my type 2 in remission without doing any exercise whatsoever, not even going for walks. The bottom line is you cannot outrun a bad diet. And the other myth that we need to debunk is that a calorie is a calorie is a calorie. All foods are not the same, nor are our body's industrial engines, and the way we process different foods differs. Those 22 grams of carb in the biscuit are going to create a huge surge in insulin, which will drive the glucose out of the bloodstream into the fat storing cells, firstly in the liver, but potentially anywhere in the body, where it'll eventually cause serious damage. Because the glucose has now disappeared from the bloodstream and our cells demand more energy, and the quickest way of getting that is to eat more carbs, ghrelin is released, resulting in the irresistible urge to eat again. So we reach for the biscuit tin or the chocolate bar, only a short while after maybe we've had our breakfast. And so the cycle goes on. On the other hand, the avocado's only got 8.5 grams of carb, most of which is fiber, so it's not going to cause glucose levels to spike at all, meaning a limited insulin response. The fat content of the avocado will give a feeling of satiety, so we're not going to be feeling hungry, nor will ghrelin be released, and therefore we won't be tempted to reach out for something else 5 minutes later. In addition, the avocado has twice the protein, and as I've said, a generous dose of fiber too. Nutritionally speaking, carbs are not an essential nutrient. Though through gluconeogenesis, I'm sure you all know this, our bodies can make all the glucose we require from the amino acids produced from the fats and proteins, which are essential nutrients. And furthermore, we can become fat adapted, burning our own body fat for fuel, reducing the need for constant eating. And so we come to the course. Based on the principles of low carb and healthy fats. Fats are essential nutrients. Half the human brain is composed of fat. A team at Harvard University, by the way, calculated that our bodies actually make 80% of the cholesterol requirement. So necessary is it to survival. So, demonizing cholesterol doesn't make sense apart from anything else. Fats are also vital for the absorption of essential fat-soluble vitamins. It's no use eating a plate of vegetables stuffed with vitamins if there's no fat with them to allow us to dissolve them and absorb them. Fats also perform the very important function of satiety, which is really important in sustaining weight loss, as well as getting blood glucose levels under control. If you aren't putting stress on your pancreas to provide rising amounts of insulin, resulting in constant hunger, leading to addictive behaviors, but you're eating meals that satisfy your nutritional needs, you soon find you can avoid snacks without effort, immediately lessening the pressure on your pancreas and allowing your body to function as it should. One of the things people on the course constantly remark on is not feeling hungry. They no longer wake up thinking of food. And this happens within a few weeks of making changes. They also report improved cognition. My brain fog has gone is a common phrase. And energy levels increase, which of course was one of the first things David Unwin noticed for himself. Across the sessions, we cover the basic mechanisms of diabetes, how insulin works and what goes wrong when blood glucose gets out of control. And I explain about carbohydrates breaking down into glucose. And obviously David Unwin's charts are extremely useful in this respect. We talk about the foods to avoid and those which we can enjoy. By the way, we're not avoiding all carbohydrates. We encourage the consumption of salads, green and cruciferous vegetables, peppers, aubergines, courgettes, celeriac, a whole range of colourful vegetables, which are going to provide a wide range of vitamins and minerals and fibre, of course. We talk about healthy fats, olive oil, coconut oil, fats in foods like avocados and nuts, the natural fats that are in meat and fish, eggs and cheese, and how we should avoid the processed vegetable oils that are high in inflammatory omega-6 fats and which cause oxidative stress to the cells of the body. We cover food labelling and how to understand labels in respect of a low-carb diet, how to interpret the healthy slogans bandied around on packaging. As mentioned before, we also talk about exercise and mindfulness, the importance of sleep and reducing stress. I provide details of useful websites, both with information and recipes, links to talks given by internationally renowned specialists in the field. I suggest videos they might like to watch, like Fixing Dad or The Magic Pill. And when we were able to do face-to-face meetings, I provided low-carb food samples every week. And from the feedback we received, that was very much appreciated, as it demonstrated that a low-carb lifestyle is anything but dull, and it gives people the impetus to go home and do it themselves. With our next Zoom courses, I continued... with our new Zoom courses, I continue to supply recipes each week and links to the sites where they can find out further information and recipes. Low carb is essentially all about eating real food and cutting out the highly processed foods that are so damaging to our health. These are results from the first course we ran last autumn at Hook. Of 9 patients who attended the whole course, there were 8 who had a diagnosis of type 2 or pre-diabetes at the start of the course. Of these, 6 had put their diabetes in remission with an HbA1c under 42 by the end of the 3 months. One of them, that's patient 9 on the chart, reduced her HbA1c by 10 millimoles, and at 58 it was the lowest it had been since 2016, and in the process she avoided an imminent ramping up of her meds. Only 1 patient showed an anomalous result. Of those who've now put their type 2 in remission, several stopped medication altogether, whilst others progressively reduced them. All the participants simply reported feeling better, less sad, more enthusiastic about life in general. And this was mirrored at Chinham. We had 13 full-time participants here. Of these, 8 had a diagnosis of type 2 or pre-diabetes. And by the end of the course, 6 had achieved remission with an HbA1c under 42. 1 person was still awaiting results at the time I compiled the table, but they went down subsequently. And the other, although not in remission, reduced his HbA1c by a significant 12 millimoles and was on a regime of insulin reduction. 2 other participants who'd been on insulin also significantly reduced the dosage. One was able to go from injecting 4 or 5 times a day to completely stopping short-acting insulin and reducing his long-acting to a single dose of 20 units, and that within just 3 weeks of starting the course. Another man who put his type 2 in remission, he went from 48 to 39, also reported huge improvements in his arthritis. He bounced up and down to show me how much easier he found it to move. And again, all the participants reported improved mood. Many were sleeping better. Amongst those who'd had taken measurements, several had reduced their blood pressure. 2 people independently reported vastly improved dental health. One man said his dentist was flabbergasted by the improvement and asked him what he'd been doing to make such improvement in such a short space of time. Becky Rogers, who some of you may know, is a senior commissioning manager from the CCG, and a colleague of hers attended one of our sessions here, and they were both really impressed by the level of engagement they observed and also how enthusiastically people had adopted their new lifestyle. And a year on, and I know that many of these people are maintaining their low-carb lifestyle now, and like me, wouldn't dream of returning to the way they used to eat. I started a new round of the course in the new year, but of course we had to suspend meetings when COVID struck. But despite this, we've seen some big improvements. One lady, for example, lost nearly 4 stone in weight, which was something demanded of her by her orthopedic surgeon so that he could do knee surgery. And several others have also lost weight and put their type 2 in remission. I then started running the course via Zoom, and in the initial 3 weeks, one of the participants lost 12 pounds in weight. Recently, I've converted the whole course into an online resource. Patients can sign up at any stage and have access to all the recorded sessions and accompanying data sheets and recipes, etc. I then run 3 separate weekly drop-in Zoom sessions, so they all have the opportunity for group interaction and a lively Q&A session. And before anyone starts the course, we discuss diabetes medication and where this should be adjusted from the start, like as with insulin and glycoside, etc. I refer them to their GP or nurse. Most of them have, and if anybody wants to refer patients and need this, again, it's on the data sheet, this the advice on reducing meds for patients. In addition to the sessions, we also have Facebook and WhatsApp groups, which function as group support for those who choose to join. We've got over 100 members now of our Facebook group, for example. In addition, they can all contact me with individual queries. And if I don't know the answer, I have a whole network of professional colleagues in the PHC, because some of the ambassadors are healthcare professionals, that are GPs, diabetes nurses, nutritionists, etc. I can contact them for advice, and obviously any medical queries are referred back to their GP or nurse. And it's here, of course, that we can all work together to support patients in taking some control over their own health. I think the results we've achieved over the past year speak for themselves, but I'm going to let one of the course participants, Sue, tell you in her own words how she feels having completed the course. Hopefully I can get this to play. Where are we? No. Is it not going to? Let me see if that'll do it.
Hi, I'm Sue Shoebridge, and together with my husband Guy, we have been following low carb since February of 2020. Last year, in 2019, we were both diagnosed with raised HbA1cs. And as such, our doctor's surgery suggested that we should go on a healthy eating course. This we did. However, a lot of the course was based around low-fat foods, eating healthy rice and pasta, brown bread. And I wasn't 100% certain that this was the way that we should be going. In February, I saw an advert on our local Facebook page from Liz saying that she was starting a low carb course together with the surgery. And I suggested to my husband that we might like to go along. He agreed, and we haven't looked back. So on that first night, we walked him to a room of other people who also had either raised HbA1cs or were already diabetics and on medication. And I sat in disbelief as Liz told me, or told us, that we should be eating full-fat Greek yogurt, that we should put double cream in our coffee, that we shouldn't be afraid of putting butter into our vegetables. This went against the grain for me. I've taught diet and fitness classes for 20 years. I taught low-fat eating for 20 years. And suddenly I was being told that fat is not the enemy. Sugar is the enemy. Carbohydrates are the enemy. I wasn't 100% convinced that first day. So a couple of weeks later, we went back to week 2. I think it's safe to say from there, we were hooked. Everything that Liz said made sense. I did my own research too. I went on to many, many Facebook pages. I went on to many websites and read about what food we should put into our bodies and what food we shouldn't put into our bodies. Suffice to say that we spent most of lockdown eating low carb, and at the end of that, well, I think the figures speak for themselves. My HbA1cs are right back down into the normal level. Guys, completely normal as well. I've lost 3 stone in weight. Guys lost 4.5 stone in weight. We've eaten foods that go against the grain, foods that I would have told people will make them put on weight. We're healthier all round. We both feel fitter. We have more energy. My skin is better. My clothes fit amazing. Guy has dropped several clothes sizes. And we're really, really happy with what we're doing. Liz LaPla, you're an amazing woman. Keep doing what you're doing, because the whole country should be eating like this.
I think you can see the difference there. And I was just going to say, actually, Guy has just very recently had a fresh blood test, and I didn't pay her to give me that personal praise. I would just like to add, but Guy's just had a blood test very recently, and his HbA1c is now down to 35. This is Stella. She again came in January, and I think you can see the transformation is breathtaking, the difference. But as she says, above all, she just feels so much healthier than she has for years. She too's awaiting a fresh blood test. Obviously, her levels had already come down from 72 to 47, but that was just by May from January. And as I say, she's just had a test last week and is waiting for the results of that. And every expectation that it will be lower than it was in May. So the low carb lifestyle is about choice. It's about hope, moving more, improving health, and eating real food. If any of you want the data sheet, you can email me at basingstokelowcarb@gmail.com, which is quite easy. Otherwise, you can email Faye. Faye's got this sheet too, and she can forward it on to you. If anyone's got any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. So hope you all found that helpful. And as I say, any questions? Faye, can I ask you first, has anybody typed any questions?
Yeah, I thought that was absolutely fantastic, Liz. Thank you so much. You're really inspirational, and you've generated so much discussion on the actual chat. They're all talking about wanting to do the low carb and cutting out their porridge for breakfast. So yeah, absolutely brilliant.
Once you've realised just what the impact is, I think, you know, you sort of, oh my God, I never knew that. But it makes sense. This is the whole point. It makes sense at the end of the day.
It really does make sense. And I think we've got to sort of make our patients aware of that. As clinicians, we need to start to think differently. You're so right. Yeah. One of the questions was, does it work for non-diabetics too? And the endpoint in terms of the cardiovascular risk. That was from Sarah.
Yeah. Firstly, the result, is it for everybody? Yes, it most certainly is. As I said, the lady that came who lost the 4 stone in weight because of her orthopedic surgeon, she was due to have knee surgery. She's not diabetic. We have quite a few people who come just I put in inverted commas, just for weight loss. But, you know, they're overweight. That means they are metabolically unhealthy. Metabolic health nowadays, I'll see if I can remember all 5 of the things. One of them is that you should have an HbA1c under 42. The other is that your waistline, if you're a woman, should be under 80 centimeters. If you're a man, I think it's 88. Another of them is that your HDL should be over 1 and your triglycerides less than 1.7, I think it is. And there's a 5th one. Anyway, there's 5 signs of metabolic health. And to be metabolically healthy, I'll answer that in a minute, Sarah. If you're not to be metabolically healthy, you should fulfill at least 3 of those criteria. If there's more than 3 that you are not fulfilling, you are metabolically unhealthy. And as I explained during that presentation, you know, you may not develop type 2 diabetes because clearly there's some people who eat vast amounts of carbs their entire life. They do not develop type 2 diabetes. But when you get somebody who's supposedly fit, who drops down dead with a heart attack at the age of 45 or 50, and everybody said, oh, but he went running every day. Yes, but was he eating platefuls of pasta and rice and everything that he considered was healthy and getting those big glucose and insulin spikes that I showed, you know, when Simon Tobin did his experiment? Yes. So he's damaging the blood glucose vessels. The issues with the cholesterol, now, you asked also about the cholesterol and the cholesterol profile. Most people on a low carbohydrate diet, their cholesterol profile will improve. In some cases, their total cholesterol will go up. And I'm going to give you the example of David Unwin's wife, Jen. She's a psychologist and works in their practice with them. And her cholesterol went up to 11. And I'm sure you'd all be jumping up and down and insisting she went on a statin. But she has high HDL, her triglycerides virtually 0. And she went and had a CAC scan, calcium coronary arterial calcium scan. Anyway, basically, that literally tells you if you are at risk of a heart attack, because it is the calcification of the arteries, obviously, that you run the risk of it splitting and breaking. You end up with a heart attack, stroke, and whatnot. She had a CAC scan, and her CAC score was literally 0. So this 11 total cholesterol is meaningless. What is far more important on the research that's been done over the last 10 years, a far better indicator of cardiovascular risk. And again, I've put a link to a scientific paper about this, or a talk given by a cardiologist about this. The risk nowadays considered far more important is your triglyceride to HDL ratio, which shouldn't be more than 2. and ideally under 1, but certainly no more than 2. If you're under 2, then your risk of cardiovascular events is much reduced. Sarah, you also asked about people being under, if they're not overweight. Yeah, the bottom line is up your fat content. If you don't want to be losing calories, you can probably eat fat more freely than somebody who, I still struggle to an extent with my weight, in that if I start eating masses of food, whatever, even good food in terms of low carb food, we went a bit mad during lockdown. We thought we'd support the artisan cheese industry, and we ordered wonderful packs of artisan cheese. And as nobody else in the house eats the blue, I ate the blue. But, if you eat your way through 200 grams of blue cheese in 2 days, that's too much, frankly. And my weight crept up. But I've knocked it back on the head and lost the few pounds that I did put on in weight loss in lockdown with no problem. But yes, so if somebody maybe starts off overweight, or even if they aren't, but yes, you can be what's called TOFI, which is fat on the inside, thin on the outside, fat on the inside, so that you maybe have the tiniest bit of spare tire, but nothing that anybody really would notice terribly much, but you have got the fat reserves around your liver and your kidneys, which are storing up damage. And of course, you're getting these insulin spikes, which is going to cause damage to the arteries over time. So yes, you may not develop type 2 diabetes, you may not even be overweight, but you may be causing damage to the arteries, because damage to the arteries caused by glucose, the cholesterol comes along to plug the gaps, because the glucose is almost creating holes in the arteries, if you will. The cholesterol comes along to plug that gap. The problem then being that the cholesterol calcifies, and over time, of course, can become brittle and break down. But the initial problem is the excess glucose. So yes, as regards, is it just for diabetes? No. There's been research in all sorts of, I mentioned arthritis, that chap who came along to us. I'm not sure if I've put it in the link to this paper, it's on my files for patients. There was a trial done in the USA for people with arthritic knees, all over 60, all with serious arthritis of the knee, and they put a third of them on it was a proper randomized controlled trial, very well controlled, and they put a third of them on a low fat diet, a third of them on a low carb diet, and a third of them sort of randomly whatever they wanted. And the ones on the low carb diet had incredible improvements, noticeable, significant improvements in their arthritis. The other thing connected with that, of course, is the vegetable oils. We all know we should eat omega-3, and, we prescribe fish oil supplements and things to people with arthritic knees because they're all the high in omega-3. But yet the vegetable fats are all omega-6. Why should we think those are healthy? Traditionally, ancestrally, the balance of omega-6 to 3 in the human diet was about 2 to 1. But with the introduction of vegetable oils in the late 19th century, and you can track the rise in heart disease from then. Before that, heart disease was virtually unknown. The only sort of heart disease that people had was as a result of things like syphilis, which can lead to heart disease, but that's not arterial heart disease. Arterial heart disease basically was unknown until the beginning of the 20th century. One of the founders of the Johns Hopkins University, I think it is, wrote at the end of the 19th century, he'd seen 6 cases of angina in the whole of his medical career. He didn't mention heart attacks because he'd never seen anybody with a heart attack. By the beginning of the 20th century, he'd seen 200 patients with angina, still nobody with a heart attack. And yet, not many years later, 20 years later, the rates of heart attacks and angina were huge. It had grown exponentially because, of course, with the spread, A, of the vegetable oils, B, the processed foods, and cheap vegetable oils and cheap carbohydrates are what keeps the food industry going. And, as we go back to the thing, who wrote the guidelines? Unfortunately, it all goes back to Ansel Keys. That's another big name in all of this back in the 1940s. I've given you loads on this data sheet. There's lots more of this information that will back up some of the things I've said today. I saw another question flash there on my screen. But yeah, if you're normal weight, yes, eat a low carb diet. It probably just means that you can eat a bit more fat than other people can.
Thank you, Liz. And the next question was, is there any health conditions that this style of eating low carb would not be recommended for?
Not that we've discovered as yet.
Sorry.
MS is another one that it's really important for. There are people, there's a woman in America, no, she's Canadian, Tracy Kilgall. She was at the state of almost being in a wheelchair. I mean, she knew that a wheelchair was literally around the corner. And she decided she wanted to lose weight. She lost weight, and in sort of pursuing that, she sort of started looking at things online and discovered about low carb and changed. And she avoided the wheelchair. All her symptoms, she'd been MS, she was diagnosed in 1980 something. She had double vision, she had migraines associated with it, she couldn't walk in a straight line, her hands were all she now takes no MS medication whatsoever, and she's fine and fit and dandy. She could get up and dress herself. She hadn't been able to do that, her husband had to help dress her. MS, epilepsy, ADHD in children, acne in teenagers. If you've got teenagers with terrible acne, get them to change their diet. Go low carb. Joanne McCormack, who's a GP, she's another founder of the PHC. She has a clinic in quite a poor area of Walsall in the Midlands, and she just about sends anybody, teenagers with as I say, with acne. Or she's had one mother who came with a son with really bad depression, sort of various sort of teenage angst problems, and she said, will you just, she got him to say, will you agree to change your diet just for a month? Do it for a month and see how the mother couldn't believe the difference in the boy, just completely turned around. So yes, it is a healthier way. It's how we all used to eat. What did our grandparents used to eat? They didn't eat processed foods. Your grandmother cooked. Your mother probably cooked. We cooked. We didn't have even when I was young. I mean, I was born in the 50s. There wasn't Tesco's. And to Tesco's, I remember the first Tesco's in Cambridge, but they didn't have all those processed foods. They did have packets of cornflakes and things, but there weren't all those aisles and aisles of highly processed ready meals full of these highly processed inflammatory vegetable oils and cheap highly processed carbohydrates. So yes, no condition. Dementia, there's research going on now about the improvements in dementia, and people who've actually, I mean, obviously, if your brain's completely disintegrated with dementia, you're not going to be able to regain your brain. But one of the things is that the blood-brain barrier in dementia becomes impeded, and the glucose that the brain requires, if you're normally eating carbohydrates, your body obviously requires this sort of constant glucose, and you're feeding it constantly, feeding it the glucose. The brain barrier becomes impeded, so the glucose can't traverse the barrier well. So you start to starve the brain of oxygen. In particular, it starts off in the pituitary gland, and that's is it the pituitary? No, the hippocampus. Sorry, not the pituitary, the hippocampus, which is the memory section, and that's why the memory is one of the first things to go. But if you go on a low carb diet, your brain can actually function on fat rather than the glucose, and the fats can traverse the blood-brain barrier in a way that the glucose can't. And so they are actually finding that people, particularly at the beginning of diagnosis, can actually halt the progression and it won't worsen. So yeah, there are definite benefits to that in terms of dementia.
I think there's two more questions. What percentage of your diet should be carbohydrate?
It's a question of finding your own personal level. I try and not go above 30. I would generally say for anybody who's diabetic to try, say, between 30 and 50. You may need to be at the lower end of that, more like the 30, even 20, some people. I mean, to Professor Tim Noakes, renowned South African, he was actually a sort of sports physician, world-renowned actually sports physician. He was the one who developed carb loading as this thing for elite athletes sort of way back when. And it was only subsequently that he realized that everything that he'd learned and everything that he'd been telling everybody was wrong. He was himself diagnosed as a type 2 diabetic and really started to look into it and discovered that, what he'd been doing was wrong. He says to keep his really down, he doesn't go above 20 grams of carbohydrate a day. I try and keep to about 30. Some days I probably don't have more than about 15. Particularly if I don't have vegetables at lunchtime and I only have a bit of spinach or cabbage or something with my supper, then I probably don't have even that amount. But it is a personal level, and if you're not diabetic, you might well manage fine on 100 grams of carbohydrate a day, which is still a lot less. The NHS are advising, you know, their limit, they say something, you should have around 300 grams of carbohydrate a day. Is it any wonder that we have a diabetes and obesity epidemic? You know, if you're eating 250, 300 grams of carbohydrate a day, that's a heck of an onslaught on your body, anybody's body. But yeah, so it is a question of finding your own personal level. Oh, and just one thing, if you've got a patient who's been on insulin for a long time, they must not go very strict low carb from the outset. They should start at about 100 and gradually reduce. I've seen a type 1 message half fly up on there, have I? Yeah, so they shouldn't, because it actually can cause permanent blindness if they suddenly cut their carbohydrates to none when they've been long term on insulin. That can be an issue. I mean, if they've only been on insulin a year or so, it's not going to be that. But if you've got patients who've been long term, they can reduce it and should, but they do need to do it more gradually.
And I think we've got from Sarah, it's obviously tailored to the individual. It's not always for everybody, like any lifestyle changes and diets.
Of course.
And also that her partner's got type 1, so the diabetic nurse didn't actually promote low carb, but was certainly not objective to it. So we're moving forward, and also has done the carb counting course, which it's part of our process. We do recommend people to go on.
Yeah.
So something else to look at.
Dr. Ian Lake, and I've put it on the link, Ian Lake that I mentioned as having had his retinopathy reversed in the last 4 years, who's type 1 diabetic GP. He's actually started his own website specifically for type 1 diabetics. So I've put a link to that on the spreadsheet. And as I say, David Cavan, that I mentioned as one of the authors of the paper on reducing medication for people on low carb diets. His books, they're two separate books. One is Self-Management of Type 1 Diabetes, Low Carb Self-Management for Type 1 Diabetics, and Low Carb Self-Management for Type 2 Diabetics. Those books are both really useful. And as an insight to that. And Emma Porter, whose cookbook I recommend, and I've put that on the data sheet as well. She's a young type 1 diabetic mum. She has a 4-year-old and a roughly 6-7 month old baby. She controls her type 1 with low carb. She has a totally normal non-diabetic, well, she has an HbA1c of I think it's about 45, and she's type 1. She controls it purely with, and the entire family, she cooks for the whole family. Her little girl of 4's never had any sort of chocolate other than 85% cocoa chocolate. So you don't have to fill your kids with sort of dairy milk.
Talking about chocolate, there was discussion, I think, somewhere back, if it's allowed.
Yeah. 85% chocolate. Certainly try and go for 85% cocoa solid chocolate. Yeah, fine. And you can make it in these. You know, we've all made Rice Krispie cakes and cornflake cakes when we were kids, haven't we? I mean, who hasn't done that? Same thing. Melt your 85% chocolate and stir in as many toasted coconut flakes as you could get. You like you would with cornflake cakes. Keep turning it until it's all coated. And I set mine in mini muffin tins, or you could just set them in, you know, teaspoonfuls on a piece of greaseproof paper. Chill them in the fridge, then pop them off the greaseproof or out of the tins, and store them in a box, you know, an airtight box in the fridge. And when you get that chocolate need, you know, go for it. We suggest that you don't snack. I mean, there's a lot more to this, you know, and you could, intermittent fasting is another sort of useful tool in all of this. And intermittent fasting can be anything from literally not snacking is the first start. And you will find if you do change to low carb, you will not, I mean, the number of people who say they can't believe, if somebody told them a month before that they wouldn't be wanting to snack anymore, they would not have believed it. But they don't, because they're eating satiating foods at their meal times. And basically, if you are feeling hungry in between meals and not just bored, because we all know we munch out of boredom as well, but if you're genuinely feeling hungry, then the answer to that is you haven't eaten enough of probably fats in your meals, because you should not feel hungry from one meal to the next. What do I have for breakfast? Well, what I have for breakfast is a cup of espresso coffee with 2 teaspoonfuls of double cream in it. End of. I don't have breakfast. I eat in the evening. I'm also a terrible midnight snacker, so I do eat something at midnight, but then I don't generally have my lunch till 3:30 in the afternoon. So I have gone from midnight to 3:30 the following afternoon without eating, apart from a couple of espresso coffees with, as I say, a spoonful of cream in it. So I've given my body all that time to burn its own fat, to control it, to work properly, to function as a human body should. But if you want some breakfast ideas, what can you have? Go for full fat yogurt, full fat Greek yogurt, a few berries. I said no to bananas, mangoes, etc., but red berries, so strawberries, raspberries, blueberries, blackberries. What would fit in a cupped hand? A few berries and a few toasted, or you don't need to toast them, you can have them fresh, chopped nuts. Avoid peanuts and cashew nuts, but things like almonds, walnuts, pecan nuts, pistachios in moderation are all fine. Just crumble a few up, chop them up. Whilst you're measuring out your yogurt, 100 grams is a good portion. 100 grams of full fat yogurt. Toast your few, you could put sunflower seeds and pumpkin seeds, for instance, a few chia seeds if you want. You can pop them into a hot dry frying pan and just toast them off whilst you're measuring out your yogurt. They'll be done. Tip them on top of your fruit and yogurt. That's one solution. Otherwise, have an omelette. That's quick and easy. Cheese omelette for breakfast, or scrambled eggs with smoked salmon if you fancy that. Just have random stuff. Have a lump of cheese and half an avocado and a couple of slices of ham. Doesn't matter. Basically, you want to be eating proteins, fats, and green vegetables, green and coloured vegetables, preferably not too many vegetables that grow underground, because they're the ones that have the carbs. Celeriac's the exception to that. Celeriac's wonderful. Don't know if any of you have made potato dauphinoise. You know, you cut potatoes really thin and you cook them in cream in the oven. It's delicious. Well, you could do that with celeriac. And we had roast pork on Sunday with all the crackling and everything, and we did not cut the fat or the crackling off. We ate that with glee. And we had a celeriac dauphinoise with it, with braised red cabbage and green beans, and I even made low-carb stuffing and apple sauce. So we had a full roast dinner, but very few carbs, perhaps, 6 or 7 grams of carb in total. So it's perfectly doable.
Delicious.
Yeah, it's totally doable. And we did talk, Faye, didn't we, at one point, of possibility of running a course for nurses. I have a colleague, Mark Hancock, in the Portsmouth area, PHC ambassador, again, come from the patient perspective like me, who's running a separate course, separate from the patients, for the nurses in the area, sort of supporting them to do the course, so that they experience it for themselves. Because I think if you experience it for yourself and, try going low carb, see the difference that it makes to your own health, then it's that much easier for you to support your patients. You can speak from personal experience and support them. There's a very good GP surgery in the East Anglia somewhere, Freshwell, and I've given you the link there. They don't have anybody who's got the time to run a course, but all the clinicians in the practice are on board, and they all hand out leaflets to their patients. As the PHC, we produce leaflets that you can get. You can either purchase them or you can just print them off. They're free to download and print. You can print off leaflets. They're all David Unwin's charts, which again you can print off in their waiting room. They've got a huge big notice board, and they've got all David Unwin's infographic charts on there. They've got all the PHC leaflets with healthy foods and meal suggestions on there, and they did a big weight loss target. They thought they would, like churches, they're raising funds for the church spire repairs, that sort of thing. They put a big arrow target up, and they've reached over a ton of weight loss in the practice, but they're all committed, so that all of them, and they actually have, apart from their NHS website, obviously practice website, they have their own, I think it's lowcarbfreshwell.co.uk. anyway, the link's on the sheet, and you can see they have a whole dedicated low carb website for their patients, as well as their GP, their normal NHS website, but that is purely the low carb aspect of it. So yeah, they go all out to do that. So although they don't run a course, the whole practice is behind this, and they're getting huge results. Again, they've published some interim results on their HbA1c reductions and things. There's also a whole booklet from sorry, I'm just going to say one more thing, and the PHC has just published a booklet, and again, that's on the link, of all people like me, and also other GPs who are running low carb courses. Dr. Ruth Tapsell and 1 or 2 others, and we've done a case study book, so that, again, the link to that, you can look through that and see work being done by other GPs and other PHC ambassadors in this field. Sorry, Faye.
No, that's absolutely fantastic. I was going to say, not just nurses, we've got a wider workforce now that we can bring in, so health coaches, social prescribers as well. Yeah.
Yeah.
But thank you so much. That was absolutely brilliant. We were already getting fantastic feedback from your presentation. So thanks for your time today, Liz.
Thank you. No problem. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye. I'll close the meeting down now. Everybody happy with that?
Yeah.
Yep, I'll close it down. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.